Hello again and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do an experiment. It's really exciting. I'm going to make a couple of paints. I'm going to make a dye-based paint and I'm going to make a mineral-based paint, and I think I'm going to do this as acrylics because I thought it'd be fun, and I might try doing another video later where I do it as watercolours. And I wanted to use this as a way to illustrate the difference between dye-based and mineral-based paints. Now, a dye-based paint is anything that contains an organic compound as the source of the colour, the chromophore, as we might say. Now, that may contain a metal still, but it's principally usually something big with benzene rings or nitrogen-nitrogen bonds in it. It's going to have a lot of carbon in it, and it will have parts of that molecule that will actually bond to cellulose or to gelatine, so it will stain your paper to some extent. They don't all stain, they stain to different degrees as well, but because they are soluble, they don't granulate really, they stain instead, and they are generally more transparent, less opaque. They have a tendency to be more fugitive, however they can break down more easily than mineral-based ones, and that's kind of how they are. Mineral-based, on the other hand, don't stain as much. Some of them do because they're slightly soluble. What a mineral-based pigment is sort of crystals or granules of a very finely dispersed mineral. Now, that might be a biologically produced mineral, like let's imagine we made a paint out of ivory, or let's go really cruel, powdered up orphan's teeth. That would be a biomineral because hydroxyapatite is the mineral that make up our teeth and bone, and indeed bone white used to be a paint many years ago, and that was made of powdered bone. And you probably could still make that from bone meal these days if you really wanted to. That would be a biomineral. Now, the majority of minerals that are used are not biominerals. They're either what you could call a geomineral or just a mineral. The minerals we pull out of the ground, things like the iron oxides, things like the cadmium sulfides and so on. But the majority of those these days are actually synthetically produced. So cadmium sulfide these days isn't necessarily a pure mineral pulled out of the ground. It can be made in a factory instead. So you have those kind of anthropogenic or man-made minerals as well. So the mineral doesn't mean a big pretty rock dug out of the ground. It just means something with those kinds of properties. And they are inorganic. They are sometimes salts, sometimes compounds, and sometimes quite complex in structure actually, but they don't generally contain carbon, or they don't contain carbon-carbon bonds more accurately. And they are generally more opaque because they sit on the paper, they don't soak into the paper. Another reason why they don't stain. Don't tend to be as fugitive, but some of them are impacted by light. So some of them, like Prussian blue, for example, will discolor and go brown under UV, long-term exposure. But if you then transfer it to darkness for a period of time, it will go back to its normal color. So it's kind of fugitive, kind of not. Now, strictly speaking, fugitive actually means that which runs away, things that actually lose their color. Discoloration is a lack of light fastness, but it's not technically being fugitive if we want to be really strict about the term. So the two minerals, or sorry, the two pigments I'm going to use today, one is an iron oxide. In fact, it's ferric oxide, which you can see here. It's not very exciting, it's a red powder. And the other one is Rhodamine 6B, which is the stuff Pigment Violet 10, Basic Violet 10, sorry, which is the stuff added to Opera Rose to give it that ethereal glow. I thought it'd be really cool to just try making a paint out of it on its own, and we'll see how it goes. Now, all paints have got a binder of some kind, and in watercolour that is either Aquazole, which is a synthetic, used by Core, made by Golden, or is a natural, in which case it would generally be, sorry, I can't get words out today, would generally be gum arabic, although there are paints that use gum frankincense and other gums out there, and I've been experimenting with gum frankincense actually as a medium. It can be quite interesting. I'm not going to use gum arabic today. I'll do that in another video. I'll do a part 2, I think. I'm going to use acrylic, and with acrylic what you have is a plastic monomer, the actual acrylic, And what that does is, as the paint dries, the monomer kind of sticks together and makes a mesh and sticks to the paper. Remembering that acrylic paints sit on the paper, they don't soak into the paper. And the paper for acrylic is really heavily, almost varnished, so that the paint sits on and the water doesn't soak in. Same with canvases, that's what the gesso's for. It stops the water soaking through. It has to evaporate. After it's dried, reactions called curing take place, and the acrylic actually becomes a plastic. It becomes polyacrylic. And once it's happened, it becomes a solid plastic. And you'll all know polyacrylic because you all have it. Those blocks we use for stamping, the clear acrylic blocks, are the polymer of acrylic, essentially. Now, I could use Mod Podge as my base for these paints because that, at the end of the day, basically is kind of like an acrylic monomer, but I'm not. I'm going to use a gel medium instead because that is an acrylic paint without the pigment. So that doesn't just have the binder, it's got all the other ingredients that make sure it flows properly and, you know, does all the things it's meant to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten my easel down so that I've got a surface to work on. I'm going to get some medium, I'm going to get my palette knife, get some containers together, and we're going to have a little play, going to mix some things together, and then we'll see what they work like when we try to paint with them. Back in a moment. Okay, I'm back. I have got some little Petri dishes here. You can buy these for storage. You can get them online. They are really Petri dishes, obviously. I use them for storing mineral specimens in my private mineral collection. So they have their uses. And what I'm going to use, I'm just trying to get the lid off, is some Impasto Gel Matte Medium from Daler and Rowney, which is basically a heavy body acrylic paint without the paint. And unfortunately the lid has gotten stuck and has broken, so I've had to prise the lid off and the thread is completely gone, so I'm probably ruined the whole tube, but we'll try it. So I'm going to squirt out a decent volume of it. Now you have to use a medium, you can't use a white paint for this because a white paint already has a pigment. There's a white pigment, and we don't want a pigment, we want something that doesn't have a pigment at all. Now there are normal body and there are heavy body paints out there. I'll try and clear up the shaky camera work in post to sort of sort that out. But I wanted to use something heavy body because I figured it would just be a little bit less runny and messy to work with. So I've got a ferric oxide, over here, which is a powdered hematite mineral, and I've got my rhodamine for my dye based. I'm going to put those on and then we'll mix them in and see how we get on. I'll do the iron first. Because I can't film and mix very easily, I'm going to just sort of put some slides in and interrupt this, but back in a sec. Okay, so I've now mixed them in. The one on the right is the one with the iron oxide, and the one on the left is the one with the rhodamine. Now, in terms of fluorescence, an important thing to understand is that that acrylic medium that I've just used, which is the one from Daler and Rowney, has got lots of ingredients in it, and I believe it has got an ultraviolet block, like a kind of suntan lotion kind of effect, that it blocks the UV light from hitting your paint and causing your paint damage. A lot of acrylics have got a UV block mixed into them to just protect the colours a little bit more, which is why they're often a lot less fugitive, obviously, than watercolours are. So I'm not expecting to see fluorescence with that one, but we'll have a go. Let's just show you what they look like. Let me move my tripod. This is the iron oxide one. Now the hematite went in red, but it's come out a really interesting purpley grey. And if you watch my video on the iron oxide pigments about how grain size is important, what we're seeing here is something that looks very much like Caput Mortuum, that sort of burgundy kind of colour. So I suspect that is due to the size of the grains being really big in this particular preparation. Ordinarily, when paints are made, the minerals are ground to a very fine tolerance, so they will only allow grain size in a very, very fine range to be used, give a consistent effect. What I'm using is quite a cheap ferric oxide preparation that contains a wider range of grain sizes. Just why you can physically see the larger grains haven't really dispersed properly in the acrylic matrix, but the rest have, and they've given us this rather interesting grey burgundy. Over here, the rhodamine is dissolved pretty well. There's still a fair amount of undissolved rhodamine there that I think if I added water would make a total mess. But I haven't mixed these in brilliantly. I've literally just stirred them in with a palette knife. I haven't done more than that. So I'm going to grab a piece of acrylic paper and we'll see how they paint. Okay, I've got a piece of acrylic paper here, and I'll link to that and the other products used in the description so that you've got them. Because I'm interested, as all of us are, in opacity, I'm going to draw a line with a pro marker in black twice on the page, just so we can get an idea for how opaque these paints that I've kind of made are. Now, this is not magical and new. I've seen Lindsay Frugal Crafter do this with eyeshadow. I've seen other people do it with all sorts of things, but you can, if you really wanted to, really finely grind any mineral and make a paint. And actually, Pip Seymour has made a fortune out of doing exactly that, of making all sorts of weird stones into paints. And you can buy a lapis lazuli ultramarine for about 19-20 pounds for a half pan, which is crazy, and all sorts of other really luxurious colours. And I really want to try those. So Pip Seymour, if you're out there, I'd love a set of your watercolours. But Pip Seymour acrylics are actually pretty reasonably priced, and I'll put some links again in the description to Pip Seymour's website and some products on Amazon so that you can see them for yourself. I'm going to paint these with a couple of brushes, actually. I'm just going to find some that are not too new and perfect, because I don't want to use brand new brushes on such shoddy quality paint. I've got, yeah, a couple of acrylic brushes here. And just to say what I use, actually, I use Daler and Rowney Simply Gold Taklon because I ruin the brushes really easily with acrylic. I mean, they've got a good spring to them, decent snap. This is a size 6 bright. I've got all sorts of brushes because you get them in packs of like 5 to 10 brushes for, I don't know, maybe £10. And you can get really good deals as well. Like you can get a really big brush like this. Well, they call it a flat, but to me it's a 2-inch Skyflow brush. That was £5-6. It's got a brilliant snap on it, and it's great for applying the ground. So I think they're really good. Good value for people who don't paint an awful lot of acrylic and don't want to spend a lot of money on the brushes. So what I'll do is a palette knife first, and we'll do the iron pigment first of all. I think I'm going to have to hold on to this with one hand. So here we go. I'm so going to drop this. So let's try an impasto type technique in one direction, and we'll brush it out in the other. And obviously I'm going to have to leave these to dry, and then I will take photos of them and include that in the finished video. Just get rid of the paint, and we'll move the camera so you can see what I'm doing. I'm using a dampened brush, so this is probably going to make a total mess. Now that might look sludgy and muddy, but actually, firstly it's slightly sparkly, and it's actually quite a nice burgundy. It is indeed Caput Mortuum, more or less. So I've used a damp brush to do that with. This is an acrylic paper, so it's got a tooth to it. It's got a sort of linen texture, I suppose I could describe it, and it's very hard, even with the best paint in the world, to get perfectly even coverage on it the first time, because it's almost got an exaggerated tooth. I think if you put a coat of gesso on it, it would behave much more like a gessoed canvas, but you do get the tooth does show through really easily. So it's holding the brush strokes pretty well, which is not surprising. It's an impasto gel, so it's designed to hold stroke. Where I have put it on with a trowel at this end, it's held on pretty well, and it's quite an interesting mottled grey, kind of a, it looks like a crushed up stone, which is exactly what it is, but it looks on the camera a kind of reddish kidney, sort of livery brown kind of colour, which is indeed a hematite kind of colour, which is quite interesting, but from the side it's actually much more like Caput Mortuum. So I think I might try and do a colour correction on this, but we'll see. it isn't an opaque colour, even when it's really thick over here, it's still translucent, so it's because I didn't put very much pigment into the mix. If I put more in, it could have been even more so. So we'll leave that, let it dry, and I'll take some photos or maybe video it later on. We'll have a look at what it looks like. So I've got another brush now, and I'm going to try, oops, I'll do it with a palette knife first again. This is the one with Rhodamine, which you can't actually buy any paints that are just Rhodamine really. There are a few, but not many. Certainly not in acrylics. So I'm going to kind of impasto one-handed here and put a large thick layer on. And because when I did this, as you'll remember, so I'll get the camera in the right place so you can actually see what I'm doing. Just having to wipe the palette knife off because this impasto gel dries pretty fast and I don't want to ruin my palette knife, as I spent a whole £2 on it. So ridiculously cheap. I'm going to paint this out first of all with a dry brush, and the reason is that those lumps you can see, those little dark spots, are undissolved Rhodamine, and I'm a little bit worried that if I add water it's just going to go everywhere as a really dark staining dye that's going to just make a total mess. But I might do that, let's see. So it's nice and translucent, even when it's thick you can still see through that, and I think on the camera you can see it even more so. So we'll see how that goes, but it's a really interesting colour, I quite like it. But you can see immediately the difference in quality between a dye and a mineral pigment. They are very, very different. There's a chalkiness over here that there isn't over here. Remember, they've got the same medium, so they've got the same basis. Now I'm just wetting the brush very slightly, and I'm just going to try spreading out the pigment a little bit, spreading out the paint. Now what's going to happen is that dye is going to dissolve, and it's probably going to kind of act a bit like a watercolour on the edges, as acrylics really sort of do when you get them wet, I suppose. I'm actually using a brush that's not even from the Simply Gold Taklon range. It's actually a really cheap one I bought years ago for glass painting, and I just realised how wobbly the ferrule is, so I'm hoping it'll get through this. Okay, let's have a look at what I've just painted out. So you can see where I painted it, the dye is kind of dissolved out of the matrix because the impasto gel will take water and pretty much stay where it is. I'll go and take those away and wash them later. So that's pretty interesting, I think. Now let's see what happens if we shine a bit of UV on it, because we know Rhodamine is a strongly UV reactive dye and it's very fluorescent. So when it's in impasto gel form, I'm just going to turn off my daylight bulb because I think that's kind of in the way a little bit. Unfortunately, the evening sun comes through the window of my studio right about now. Yeah, you can see the fluorescence of that really clearly. Sort of an orangey pink in this particular Rhodamine. You can see streaks of it there, those orange streaks in the middle of the spot of light. They're the fluorescence, where it's really kind of clear. Yeah, you can really see it there really easily. It's not as vivid in an acrylic base as it is in Opera Rose, but it's exactly the same. However, where it's been in water down here, the camera can't even handle how fluorescent that is. So where I've added water and actually dissolved it and got it into a really thin layer, it is producing, I can see, absolutely pure glow of pink. Remember, the acrylic paper has got a brightener in it, so that's why it's showing as blue. But yeah, there's a really vivid pink fluorescence over the whole thing. So bright, I can barely pick it up actually. The camera's really struggling. I'll pull the camera out and see if it can still see it. Yeah, there you go. Beautiful pink fluorescence. So I've made myself a fluorescent pink paint using Rhodamine, which I think is pretty cool. I don't know whether I'll use it for anything. I'm going to seal it up in a little container and we'll see if it's useful for anything later. But I've also made quite an interesting kind of modified Caput Mortuum, I guess, over here. And we'll see if that does anything interesting when it dries. It's quite an interesting gritty texture where it's been used in impasto, and this one's very smooth, even though it's got those dark spots you can see of undissolved dye. it's still actually quite a nice texture, and I think if I'd put a bit more effort into making it, I could have got a really, really cool colour. So I'm going to leave those to dry, and then I will come back and have a look at them, and we'll see if they were worth making. I'm back, and it's a few hours later, and I wanted to have a look at how those paints that I put together earlier on have turned out. As it's almost dinner time, I couldn't be bothered to get my tripod out, so I'll try and anti-shake this later. Just doing it really quickly just to show you. So first of all, the one I did with Rhodamine, you can see there quite clearly, if I can get the autofocus to work. Let me point with a brush. It's easier when I've got something to focus on. Sorry everyone, there we go. Yeah, you can see those speckles are dye that didn't get fully incorporated. So this is the area where I applied it impasto styly, and you can see it held its consistency really well. It's a lovely transparent gel. I can push on it and it's really nice. So made a lovely transparent red gel there, and where it's thinned out it shows as pink, and where I spread it nice and thin you can still see it. And then where I used water, it doesn't feel gritty or anything, or like a gel sitting on the paper. It feels like using a normal acrylic. So impasto gel medium here really clearly showing, and when I added water, this is much more like the texture of a normal transparent acrylic paint. Let's just see, now it's dried and the curing process has started for the acrylic, and the acrylic is at least set. First of all, just with a white light, just to see how it looks under close-up white light. And now I'll switch to ultraviolet over here first of all. Now I can see really clearly that kind of orange fire. It's almost like an opal. Beautiful, beautiful fluorescence throughout the whole thing. Again, the fluorescence tends to overload the camera. You need to use a particular type of camera to film fluorescence properly, and to use a filter to block out the UV so that you just see the glow much more easily. We have the problem, we've got the blue glow of the paper kind of showing through it, but where I'm looking at it over the top of the camera myself, I can see it really clearly. So I've got a lovely fluorescent paint there. It's really, really nice. Moving over to the iron one, the one where I used iron oxide to make a paint. This is very much like Caput Mortuum when it was still wet, but now it's dried down, it's actually much darker, and it's much, much different. It's really not like Caput Mortuum now it's dried at all. So that's another thing that's kind of important to note. When things are wet, they can look really different, especially mineral pigments. So whenever you're painting with something that involves a mineral, beware of the normal rules. Watercolours dry lighter, acrylics dry darker, because when acrylic dries it contracts slightly, so that's why things tend to look darker through it, because it does kind of shrink. The particles have now moved closer together, so what we're seeing instead of that lovely burgundy is this deep brown. So the impasto end of the spectrum up here, you know, it's not very good coverage. A translucent paint, it's very granular, very particular, it's not evenly dispersed, but you know, I mixed this in about a minute in a Petri dish with a palette knife. I didn't mull it properly, so what was I expecting? I wasn't trying to make a proper paint, guys. I was just trying to show you the principles, as I think most of you will know, but there's always someone who comments. Please don't bother. So where I've done impasto with it, actually it's pretty effective, and I would probably use this mix again if I were painting rocks or sand or something, because this is really nice. I'll show you some sand, actually, a little effect I did in another video I'm going to upload. In this area where I used water and brushed it out, it again feels and looks much more like a normal paint. I'm really pleased with this Rhodamine one because I've got a transparent red, and that's a really useful thing to have, because a lot of red paints are not transparent. They're fairly opaque and chalky and translucent when dry, so to have a transparent acrylic is really nice. I'm going to do a follow-up on this where I'm going to make watercolour versions of the same things to show you how watercolour would come out instead. So thank you very much. Good evening.